The year is 1863. The United States of America is no longer united. It is a nation fractured, a house divided against itself, bleeding from 1,000 wounds in a brutal civil war. 3 long, agonizing years have passed since the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, and the initial patriotic fervor on both sides has long since evaporated, replaced by a grim, soul-crushing weariness. Imagine the scene. In the North, the Union, with its industrial might and larger population, was supposed to secure a swift victory. That was the promise. But the reality has been a bitter pill to swallow, a string of devastating defeats, particularly in the Eastern Theater under a carousel of cautious generals, has shaken public confidence. The casualty lists in newspapers grow longer each day, stretching like grim shadows into every town and city. The initial torrent of volunteers has slowed to a trickle, forcing the government to enact a deeply unpopular draft, sparking riots in cities like New York. The cost of the war, both in blood and treasure, is staring. People are asking, is Sid worth it? Voices of dissent, the so-called copperheads, grow louder, calling for peace at any price, even if it means letting the South go and shattering the American experiment forever. The Union's spirit is sagging under the immense weight of frustration and loss. Now, turn your gaze south, to the Confederacy. Here, a different kind of exhaustion has set in, one born of desperation. The South has achieved stunning victories on the battlefield, thanks to brilliant, audacious generals like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. They've managed to defy the odds time and again, repelling a much larger and better equipped foe. Their soldiers are tough, motivated by the defense of their homes and their way of life. But these victories have come at an unimaginable cost. The Confederacy is bleeding men it cannot replace. Its agricultural economy, once its pride, is crippled. The Union naval blockade strangles its coastline, cutting off vital supplies from Europe. Shortages are rampant. Salt, coffee, medicine once common staples are now precious luxuries. Inflation is out of control, with Confederate money becoming nearly worthless. The Southern home front is a landscape of scarcity and sacrifice. Women manage farms and businesses with their men away at war, all while enduring constant anxiety and growing hunger. Despite their military prowess, the foundations of the Confederacy are cracking under the immense strain. They are winning battles, but they are losing the war of attrition. So, as 1863 dawns, the entire nation holds its breath. The outcome is anything but certain. It feels like a stalemate, a bloody, grinding deadlock where neither side can land the final, decisive blow. For the Union, the question is one of will. Can President Abraham Lincoln keep the North committed to the fight? Can he find a general who is willing to take the fight to the enemy and win? The Emancipation Proclamation has just taken effect, fundamentally changing the nature of the war. It's no longer just about preserving the Union. It's now a crusade against slavery. But this bold move has also alienated many, and it remains to be seen if it will inspire a renewed sense of purpose or simply deepen the divisions. The Union needs a victory, a big one, to silence the critics and reignite the fires of patriotism. For the Confederacy, the question is one of survival. How much longer can they hold out? Their strategy has been to make the war so costly, so bloody, that the North will simply give up and go home. Lee knows he can't win a protracted war. He needs to take a gamble, to risk everything on a bold stroke that could shatter Union morale and force Lincoln to the negotiating table. He believes one more spectacular victory, this time on Northern soil, might be enough to convince European powers like Britain and France to finally recognize the Confederacy and intervene on their behalf. It is a desperate, high-stakes strategy, but desperation is all they have left. This is the backdrop for the epic events to come. 2 massive armies are maneuvering, gathering their strength for what they sense will be a climactic confrontation. In the West, Union General Ulysses S. Grant is tightening his grip on Vicksburg, the last Confederate fortress on the Mississippi River. Its fall would cut the Confederacy in two, and in the East, Robert E. Lee is planning his most audacious move yet, an invasion of Pennsylvania. The fates of these 2 campaigns are intertwined, and their outcomes will shape the destiny of the nation. The year 1863 is not just another year of war. It is the tipping point, the moment where the balance could shift irrevocably. Both sides are exhausted, but neither is broken. Both are desperate for a victory that could end a seemingly endless slaughter. Everything is on the line. The future of the Republic, the fate of 4 million enslaved people, and the very definition of what it means to be an American. A small town in Pennsylvania named Gettysburg is about to enter the history books, and the world will never be the same. Join us as we explore this pivotal year, a year that would become the beginning of the end. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe as we continue this journey through one of the most consequential moments in American history. Before the first cannon roared, before the first soldier fell, Gettysburg was just a quiet, unassuming town nestled in the rolling hills of southern Pennsylvania. It was a place of farmers, merchants, and students, with a population of just around 2,400 people. You could walk its streets and hear the gentle clatter of wagon wheels on cobblestone, the distant lowing of cattle, and the murmur of daily life. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary American town, far from the epicenters of power and conflict. Yet, this sleepy crossroads was about to become the stage for the most famous battle in American history. And the reason, funnily enough, had nothing to do with a grand strategic plan. Neither the Union nor the Confederate Army woke up one morning and decided, let's fight at Gettysburg. In fact, it was almost an accident, a collision of two massive forces drawn together by something far more mundane than military genius: the road network. Imagine looking at a map of southern Pennsylvania from 1863. You see a web of roads spreading out like the spokes of a wheel. And right at the hub, at the very center of it all, is Gettysburg. 10 major roads converged on this little town. From the north came the road from Carlisle. From T.E., yes, the roads from York and Hanover. From the south, the Baltimore Pike and Taneytown Road snaked their way up from Maryland. And from the west, the Chambersburg Pike, a vital artery, stretched out towards the Blue Ridge Mountains. For any army on the move, this was a logistical paradise. Controlling Gettysburg meant controlling movement in every direction. It was like holding the keys to the entire region. An army could quickly concentrate its forces here, or disperse them just as rapidly. To react to enemy movements, this network of roads made Gettysburg a natural point of concentration, a magnet for armies maneuvering through the area. So, as June of 1863 drew to a close, this is exactly what started to happen. General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was deep into its second invasion of the North. His forces were spread out across Pennsylvania, foraging for supplies and causing a panic. Some of his divisions were near Carlisle, others were threatening Harrisburg, the state capital, and some were as far east as the Susquehanna River, near York. Lee's army was a sprawling, powerful machine, but it was also dispersed. He needed to bring his scattered units together, to consolidate his strength before confronting the Union army that was now hunting him down. Where was the logical place to do that? A place with roads leading in from all directions. A place like Gettysburg. Meanwhile, the Union Army of the Potomac, under its brand new commander General George Meade, was in hot pursuit. Meade had only been in command for a few days, and his primary goal was to find Lee's army and protect the major northern cities like Baltimore and Washington, D.C. His army was also moving north, using the road network to close the distance with the Confederates. As Confederate units began to move towards Gettysburg to regroup and search for supplies, including a rumored stockpile of shoestay, didn't expect to find much resistance. They believed the main Union force was still far to the south, but they were wrong. On the morning of July 1st, a Confederate division under General Henry Heth marched down the Chambersburg Pike towards the town. Their objective wasn't to start a massive battle, but simply to scout the area and see what was there. What they found was not an undefended town full of supplies. Instead, they ran into Union cavalry, troopers under the command of General John Buford. Buford was a sharp, experienced cavalryman, and he immediately understood the importance of the ground around Gettysburg. He saw the high ridges and hills south of the town: Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and the long spine of Cemetery Ridge. He knew that if the Union Army could hold that high ground, they would have a tremendous defensive advantage. So, even though his men were heavily outnumbered, Buford made a crucial decision: to fight a delay in action. His plan was to hold off the Confederates for as long as possible, buying precious time for the main body of the Union infantry to arrive and occupy those critical hills. The initial clash on that July morning wasn't a grand, planned engagement. It was a meeting engagement, an unplanned collision that rapidly escalated as Head's Confederates pushed forward. Buford's dismounted cavalrymen put up a fierce fight, using their fast-firing carbines to slow the rebel advance. The sound of gunfire echoed across the fields west of town, a sound that acted like a signal. It drew in more and more units from both sides, like moths to a flame. The roads that made Gettysburg a strategic crossroads now became channels, funneling tens of thousands of soldiers towards the growing battle. A Confederate division to the north heard the fighting and turned towards Gettysburg. The Union First Corps, the closest infantry support, heard the sounds of Buford's struggle and force-marched towards the town to reinforce him. What started as a small skirmish for shoes and information was rapidly spiraling into a full-blown battle. The very geography that made Gettysburg a convenient meeting point was now ensuring that the fight, once started, would be a massive one. The town's strategic value wasn't in its forts or its factories, but in its simple, dirt-paved roads. By midday on July 1st, the battle had swelled into a major conflict involving thousands of men on both sides. The Union forces were desperately trying to hold their ground on the ridges north and west of the town, but more and more Confederate divisions were arriving. The rebels, converging on Gettysburg from the north and west, began to overlap and overwhelm the Union lines. Despite a heroic and costly stand, the Union 1st and 11th Corps were eventually forced to retreat. They fell back through the streets of Gettysburg, a chaotic and bloody withdrawal, and scrambled to rally on the high ground Buford had identified earlier, Cemetery Hill and Culpes Hill, just south of the town. This was the moment of truth. The Confederates had won the first day's fight and had taken the town itself, but the Union Army now held the high ground, the good ground that would become the backbone of their famous fishhook defensive line. The stage was now set for the next 2 days of brutal combat. So, when we ask why the Battle of Gettysburg happened, the answer isn't found in a grand strategy session in Richmond or Washington. It's found in the humble geography of a Pennsylvania town. It was a place where roads met, a natural point of convergence for two massive armies on the move. It was an accidental battlefield that became a decisive one, chosen not by generals, but by geography. The quiet town became the epicenter of the storm because all roads, quite literally, led to Gettysburg. Before a single shot was fired, its fate was sealed by the lines drawn on a map, the spokes of a wheel that would soon be drenched in blood and forever etched into the heart of American history. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe for the next chapter in our series on Gettysburg. Welcome back to our series on the American Civil War. Today, we're diving into Chapter 3, Lee's Ambitious Plan. After a string of impressive victories in Virginia, Confederate General Robert E. Lee was feeling confident, but he knew that simply defending the South wasn't enough to win the war. He needed to do something bold, something that would shake the Union to its core. His solution: take the war to the North. Imagine the audacity of this plan. In the summer of 1863, Lee decided to march his army of Northern Virginia across the Potomac River and into enemy territory. This wasn't just a raid, it was a full-scale invasion. His primary targets were Pennsylvania and Maryland. But why? What was he hoping to achieve with such a risky maneuver? Well, Lee had several strategic goals in mind, each one a crucial piece of a much larger puzzle. First and foremost, Lee wanted to relieve the pressure on war-torn Virginia. For 2 years, the state had been the primary battleground. Its farms were destroyed, its resources were depleted, and its people were exhausted. By moving the fighting north, Lee could give Virginia a much-needed break to recover and resupply. His army could live off the enemy's land, foraging for food and supplies from the rich, untouched farms of Pennsylvania. This would not only feed his hungry soldiers, but also inflict the direct costs of war on northern civilians, for the first time on such a scale. Secondly, Lee was playing a high-stakes political game. The war was becoming increasingly unpopular in the North. A growing movement, known as the Copperheads, was calling for an immediate peace settlement with the Confederacy. Lee believed that a major Confederate victory on Northern soil would be a massive blow to Union morale. It could strengthen the peace movement, turn public opinion against President Lincoln's administration, and maybe, just maybe, forced Washington to the negotiating table. He wasn't just fighting soldiers. He was fighting for the hearts and minds of the northern populace. A victory in the North could have international implications as well. The Confederacy had been desperately seeking recognition and support from European powers like Great Britain and France. These nations were hesitant, watching to see if the South could prove it was a viable, independent nation capable of winning the war. A decisive victory on Union territory might be the very thing that convinces them to intervene, either through diplomatic recognition or even military aid. It was a long shot, but the potential payoff was enormous. Lee's plan was also a direct challenge to the Union Army. By invading the North, he was essentially daring them to come and stop him. He hoped to draw the Union's main fighting force, the Army of the Potomac, out into the open for a decisive battle. Lee was a master of strategy and tactics, and he had immense faith in his men. He believed that if he could pick the time and place for a major engagement, his veterans could defeat the larger, but often less effectively led, Union Army once and for all. This one great battle, he hoped, could effectively end the war. So, the stage was set. In June of 1863, Lee's army began its long march northward, a great glad column stretching for miles. They moved with a sense of purpose, filled with the confidence of past victories. They were heading for Pennsylvania, for a showdown that they believed would secure their independence. This was more than just a military campaign. It was a gamble for the very existence of the Confederacy. Lee was risking everything on one bold move, one ambitious plan. The Union Army, under its new Commander General George Meade, was in pursuit. The chase was on, a massive game of cat and mouse, played out across the rolling hills and farmlands of the North. The two armies were on a collision course, though neither side knew exactly where or when the inevitable clash would occur. Little did they know, their paths would converge on a small, quiet Pennsylvania town that was about to become the site of the most famous battle in American history, a town called Gettysburg. Lee's ambitious plan was in motion, but it was fraught with risk. His army was deep in enemy territory, far from its supply lines. Communication was difficult, and he was essentially blind to the Union Army's exact movements, because his cavalry, the eyes and ears of his force, was off on a separate, controversial raid. Lee was counting on his army's skill, his own strategic genius, and a bit of luck to see him through. This invasion was the high watermark of the Confederacy. It represented the South's best, and perhaps last, chance to win the war on its own terms. The fate of the nation, both North and South, hung in the balance, dependent on the outcome of this daring campaign. Would Lee's gamble pay off? Could he achieve that one great victory that would force the Union to sue for peace? Or would the invasion end in disaster, crippling the Confederacy and turning the tide of the war for good? The answers to these questions would be found in the bloody fields and rocky ridges of Gettysburg. Join us next time as we explore the opening moves of the battle that would define a nation. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into the American Civil War. In this chapter, we're going to explore a critical turning point for the Union. A moment when the pressure to secure a decisive victory was almost unbearable. Imagine this. It's the early stages of the war, and things are not looking good for the North. The Union has just suffered a series of demoralizing defeats, and the Confederate Army, led by the brilliant and audacious General Robert E. Lee, seems almost unstoppable. Let's set the scene. The war began with a surge of patriotic fervor on both sides. In the North, people expected a swift, decisive campaign to crush the rebellion and restore the Union. The famous cry was on to Richmond, the Confederate capital. The general belief was that one big battle would end it all. But reality hit hard and fast. The First Battle of Bull Run, also known as First Manassas, was a shocking wake-up call. Union forces, confident of victory, were routed by the Confederates. Spectators who had come from Washington, D.C. with picnic baskets to watch the battle found themselves scrambling back in a panic alongside the retreating soldiers. It was a national humiliation. This defeat sent shockwaves through the North. The illusion of a quick war was shattered. President Abraham Lincoln and his administration were now faced with a grim reality. This was going to be a long, bloody, and difficult conflict. The pressure on Lincoln was immense. He wasn't just fighting a war on the battlefield. He was fighting a political war at home. Anti-war sentiment, driven by factions known as Copperheads, was growing. These groups argued for peace with the Confederacy, which would have meant the permanent dissolution of the United States. Every Union loss gave these voices more power and weakened Lincoln's position. In the wake of Bull Run, Lincoln appointed General George B. McClellan to command the main Union force, the Army of the Potomac. McClellan was a master organizer. He took the raw, demoralized recruits and forged them into a magnificent, well-trained, and well-equipped fighting machine. The soldiers loved him. They called him Little Mac. He restored their morale and their confidence. But McClellan had a fatal flaw. He was overly cautious. He constantly overestimated the strength of his enemy and was reluctant to commit his troops to battle unless he believed he had overwhelming superiority. This led to the Peninsula Campaign in the spring and summer of 1862. McClellan's grand plan was to bypass the main Confederate defenses and advance on Richmond from the southeast. It was a brilliant plan on paper, but in execution, it was a slow grinding affair. McClellan's hesitation gave the Confederates time to react. During this campaign, the Confederate commander was wounded, and Robert E. Lee took command. This was a pivotal moment. Lee was the complete opposite of McClellan. He was bold, aggressive, and a master of taking calculated risks. In a series of engagements, known as the 7 Days Battles, Lee, with a smaller army, aggressively attacked McClellan's forces, pushing them back from the outskirts of Richmond. While the Union Army inflicted heavier casualties on the Confederates, McClellan perceived it as a major defeat. He withdrew his army, and the campaign ended in failure. The Union was once again demoralized. The great army that was supposed to capture the Confederate capital was now retreating. The string of bad news didn't stop there. While McClellan was licking his wounds, Lincoln turned to another general, John Pope, to lead a new army and take the fight to the Confederates. Pope was arrogant and brash, the polar opposite of the cautious McClellan. He promised a more aggressive approach, but at the Second Battle of Bull Run, in August 1862, he was completely outmaneuvered and decisively defeated by Lee and his trusted subordinate, Stonewall Jackson. It was an even more resounding Confederate victory than the first battle on the same ground. The Union Army was once again sent reeling back towards the defenses of Washington, D.C. By the late summer of 1862, the situation for the Union was dire. 2 major campaigns to take Richmond had failed. The Confederate Army under Lee was riding a wave of incredible momentum. They had defended their capital and had twice humiliated the main Union armies in the Eastern Theater. Confederate morale was, they felt, invincible. In the North, the mood was one of despair. The public was growing weary of the constant defeats, the mounting casualty lists, and the seemingly endless war. Lincoln was under a mountain of pressure. He needed a victory. He needed to show the people of the North that the Union could win, that the sacrifice was not in vain. He also needed a victory for diplomatic reasons. Britain and France were closely watching the conflict. They were dependent on Southern cotton and were considering formally recognizing the Confederacy and providing aid. Another major Confederate victory could have been the final push they needed to intervene, which would have been catastrophic for the Union cause. Furthermore, Lincoln had a powerful political tool he wanted to use, but he couldn't do it from a position of weakness. This was the Emancipation Proclamation. For months, Lincoln had been contemplating a decree that would free the slaves in the rebellious states. This would transform the war, turning it from a conflict to preserve the Union into a moral crusade against slavery. It would also cripple the Confederate war effort, which relied heavily on enslaved labor. But Lincoln's cabinet advised him to wait for a battlefield victory. Issuing such a radical proclamation after a series of defeats would look like a desperate last-ditch effort. Last-ditch effort, as one cabinet member put it, our last shriek on the retreat. So, everything hinged on the next battle. The Union desperately needed to stop Lee's momentum. They needed to prove that their armies could stand up to the legendary Confederate general. They needed to give the Northern public a reason to keep faith in the war effort. And President Lincoln needed that victory to change the very nature of the war itself. The stage was set for a confrontation that would have enormous consequences. Lee, emboldened by his recent successes, decided to take the war to the North for the first time, invading Maryland. He was hoping to win a decisive victory on Union soil, which he believed might end the war. This bold move would lead to the single bloodiest day in American history and provide the moment of truth that the Union so desperately needed. The fate of the nation hung in the balance, and that's where we'll pick up next time. With the lead up to the Battle of Antietam, it was the clash that would finally give Lincoln the opportunity he was waiting for. A bloody, hard-fought battle that would change the course of the Civil War forever. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in our series. Se yo den. Welcome back to our series. Today, we dive into Chapter 5. Armies Drawn by Chance. It asks the story of how the largest battle ever fought in North America began, not with a grand strategy, but with a search for shoes. The stage is set in late June 1863. General Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army of Northern Virginia has pushed deep into Pennsylvania. They are an invading force on Union soil, and their presence has sent waves of panic across the North. Cities like Harrisburg and Philadelphia are bracing for an attack. The Confederate soldiers, far from their supply lines, are living off the land. They are battle-hardened and confident after a string of victories, but their uniforms are tattered and many are marching barefoot. Meanwhile, the Union's Army of the Potomac is in pursuit. They've just been assigned a new commander, General George Meade, only 3 days before the battle begins. Meade is cautious, tasked with the monumental job of protecting Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, while also finding and defeating Lee's formidable army. The Union soldiers are better supplied, but their morale has been shaken by recent defeats. They are marching hard, trying to pinpoint the location of the scattered Confederate forces. At this point, neither army has any intention of fighting a decisive battle at the small, quiet crossroads town of Gettysburg. It's a place few commanders on either side had ever heard of. The scene that triggers the entire battle is almost mundane. On the morning of June 30th, a Confederate brigade under General James Johnston Petty, part of General Henry Hett's division, marches towards Gettysburg. Their mission? To search for supplies. Rumor has it there's a shoe factory or a large store of footwear in the town. For an army with thousands of shoeless men, this is a critical objective. As Pettigrew's men approach the town from the west, they spot something unexpected. Union cavalry. These are the troopers of General John Buford's division, the vanguard of the Union Army. Pettigrew, under orders not to initiate a major engagement, observes the Union presence and wisely pulls his troops back. He reports his findings to his superiors. Hettenap. They are skeptical. They believe the troops in Gettysburg are likely just local militia, not the veteran Army of the Potomac. General Lee himself had instructed his army to avoid a general engagement until it was fully concentrated. So, based on this assumption, Het decides to press the issue. He gets permission from his corps commander, A.P. Hill, to march his entire division to Gettysburg the next morning. Voulez, Wunoasit, to brush aside whatever minor resistance is there and seize those desperately needed supplies. It's a decision based on a critical underestimation of the enemy. On the Union side, General John Buford is a sharp and experienced cavalryman. He recognizes the strategic importance of the high ground south of Gettysburg Hills like Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and the Round Tops. He knows that if the Confederates seize this terrain, any Union army arriving will be at a massive disadvantage. Buford understands immediately that the force Pettigrew led was no simple patrol. It was the leading edge of a much larger Confederate body. He makes a fateful decision. Instead of pulling back, he decides to stand and fight. He will use his small cavalry division, only about 2,700 men, to hold off the advancing Confederates for as long as possible. His plan is to create a delaying action, buying precious time for the Union infantry, specifically General John Reynolds' First Corps, to arrive and occupy the crucial high ground. Buford deploys his troopers in a series of dismounted skirmish lines west and north of Gettysburg. Armed with their fast-firing Sharps carbines, they can put up a volume of fire far greater than their numbers would suggest. On the evening of June 30th, Buford sends urgent messages to General Reynolds, pleading for him to hurry his infantry forward. He famously tells his subordinate, "The devil's to pay." He knows that the next morning will bring a desperate fight, one that his small command cannot win, but one they must endure. And so, as dawn breaks on July 1st, 1863, two armies are on a collision course. drawn to Gettysburg by a series of accidents, assumptions, and the sharp instincts of a few key commanders. General Hett's Confederate division advances from the west, expecting to scatter some militia and find shoes. Instead, they run head-on into Buford's determined cavalrymen, dug in along McPherson's Ridge. The first shots of the Battle of Gettysburg are fired. The sound of carbines and artillery echoes across the Pennsylvania fields, signaling the start of a fight that neither Lee nor Meade had planned for. The battle begins as a meeting engagement, a type of fight where both sides are essentially caught by surprise and forced to react as events unfold. Hett's Confederates deploy and push forward, but they are stunned by the stiff resistance from Buford's dismounted troopers. The Union cavalrymen use every tree, fence, and fold in the ground for cover, their carbines cracking in the morning air. They fight a brilliant delay in action, trading ground for time, just as Buford planned. But they are outnumbered and outgunned. The pressure is immense. Just as Buford's lines are about to break, the rumble of marching columns is heard from the south. It's the lead elements of the Union First Corps, with General Reynolds himself riding at their head. Reynolds meets with Buford on the ridge and quickly grasps the situation. He sees the importance of the ground and the necessity of holding it. He orders his infantry to deploy and relieve the exhausted cavalrymen, shouting, "Let's drive those fellows out of there." Reynolds personally leads the famed Iron Brigade into the fight, turning the tide for a moment. But in the chaos of the opening clash, Reynolds is struck and killed, becoming the highest-ranking officer on either side to die at Gettysburg. His death is a huge blow to the Union, but his decisive action has committed the Union Army to the fight at Gettysburg. The battle now escalates uncontrollably. More and more units from both armies are drawn into the vortex. What started as a skirmish for supplies has now spiraled into a full-scale battle, with corps from both sides marching hard to the sound of the guns. The chants encounter has set the stage for 3 days of brutal combat that will change the course of the Civil War. It's a powerful reminder of how history often turns not on grand plans, but on the unforeseen consequences of small decisions made by soldiers on the ground. The search for shoes had led, by a cruel twist of fate, to the bloodiest battle in American history. Thank you for watching. If you found this chapter insightful, please like this video and subscribe for our next installment. See you next time. Welcome back to our journey through the American Civil War. We've arrived at Chapter 6, and the date is July 1st, 1863. The quiet town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, is about to become the unwilling host to one of the most pivotal battles in American history. What started as a chance encounter is about to explode into a full-scale conflict. Imagine the scene. It's early morning. A Confederate division under Major General Henry Hett is marching towards Gettysburg. Their goal, they're looking for supplies, specifically shoes. They don't expect a major fight, but waiting for them, just west of town, is a small force of Union cavalry, commanded by Brigadier General John Buford. Buford is a sharp, experienced officer. He sees the high ground south of Gettysburg Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and the Round Tupson knows instantly that this is the place to make a stand. His mission is simple but crucial. Delay the Confederates long enough for the main Union army to arrive and occupy those hills. As Hett's Confederates advance along the Chambersburg Pike, they run into Buford's dismounted cavalrymen. The first shots of the Battle of Gettysburg ring out across the fields. Buford's troopers are heavily outnumbered, but they are armed with new, rapid-firing carbines. They fight stubbornly, using the terrain to their advantage, falling back from one ridge to the next, buying precious time. Their stand is heroic. 4 hours. This small cavalry force holds back an entire infantry division, but they can't hold on forever. The pressure is immense. Just as Buford's line is about to break, reinforcements arrive. The Union's First Corps, led by the respected Major General John Reynolds, rushes to the scene. Reynolds is a dynamic commander. He rides up to Buford, asks, "What's the matter, John?" And upon learning the situation, he makes a fateful decision. He orders his infantry into the fight, famously shouting, "Forward! For God's sake! Forward!" and personally leads the 1st Brigade into the fray. The arrival of the First Corps turns the skirmish into a major battle. The fighting intensifies, spreading across McPherson's Ridge and Herbst Woods. The legendary Iron Brigade, known for their distinctive black hats and fierce reputation, charges into the woods to counter the Confederate advance. The fighting is close and desperate. Tragically, in the opening moments of this engagement, General Reynolds is struck and killed, becoming one of the highest-ranking officers to fall at Gettysburg. His loss is a huge blow to the Union, but his decision to commit his troops has sealed the fate of this location. The battle for Gettysburg is on. Throughout the morning, more troops from both sides pour into the area. The Union's 11th Corps arrives and extends the line north of the town. The Confederates, meanwhile, are also being heavily reinforced. Generals Richard Ewell and A.P. Hill bring their powerful corps to the field, pressing the Union lines from the west and the north. The Union soldiers find themselves in a difficult position, holding a long, semicircular line that is being squeezed from multiple directions. Despite their initial success and courageous stands, the Union forces are simply overwhelmed. The sheer numbers and the coordinated Confederate attacks prove to be too much. By mid-afternoon, the Union lines begin to crumble. First, the 11th Corps north of town gives way, and then the pressure on the 1st Corps west of town becomes unbearable. A fighting retreat begins. The Union soldiers fall back through the streets of Gettysburg itself. It's a scene of chaos and confusion, as regiments become separated and soldiers try to navigate the unfamiliar town while under fire. Many are captured during this retreat. But remember General Buford's foresight. He saw the importance of the high ground south of town. As the Union troops retreat through Gettysburg, they aren't just running aimlessly. They are heading for the strategic hills that their commanders had identified as the ultimate defensive position. General Winfield Scott Hancock, sent by the Union Army's commander, General Meade, arrives on the scene to organize the defense. Hancock is a commanding presence, and his leadership is instrumental in rallying the broken units and establishing a strong new defensive line on Cemetery Hill and Culpes Hill. As the sun begins to set on July 1st, the first day of the battle comes to a close. The Confederates have won the day's engagement. They have pushed the Union Army off the ridges west and north of Gettysburg and have occupied the town itself. They are feeling confident, even victorious. However, the Union Army, though battered, now holds the high ground. They have been pushed back to a formidable defensive position, a fishhook-shaped line that will become legendary. The stage is set for an even larger and more brutal confrontation. The first day was a chaotic, escalating encounter that neither side had fully planned. But now, with the main body of both armies converging on this small Pennsylvania town, the decisions made on the evening of July 1st and the morning of July 2nd will determine the course of the battle and perhaps the course of the war. The first encounter is over, but the fight for Gettysburg has only just begun. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the first day of Gettysburg. The story is far from over. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because in our next chapter, we'll explore the brutal fighting of Day 2, a day of famous charges and desperate defenses on places like Little Round Top and the Wheat Field. We'll see you then. Welcome back to our series. In today's chapter, we re-dive in deep into one of the most fundamental principles of military strategy, the importance of the high ground. And there's no better case study than the Union Army's position. At the Battle of Gettysburg, what happened on the first day of the battle was chaotic. A brutal fight that saw Union forces pushed back through the town. It looked like a disaster. But as they retreated, something incredible happened. They didn't just scatter. They fell back to a series of hills and ridges south of town. Cemetery Hill, Culpes Hill, and Cemetery Ridge. This wasn't just a lucky break. It was the moment that turned the tide of the entire battle. So, why was this high ground so crucial? Let's break it down. First, visibility. From these heights, Union generals like Winfield, Scott Hancock, could see everything. They could watch the Confederate forces moving below, anticipate their attacks, and shift their own troops to meet the threats. Imagine being able to see your opponent's every move on a giant chessboard. That was the advantage the Union had. They weren't fighting blind. They had a panoramic view of the battlefield, allowing them to make informed, real-time decisions. This intelligence advantage alone was immense. Next, let's talk about defense. Fighting uphill is exhausting and incredibly difficult. Think about it. Confederate soldiers had to charge across open fields, often for a mile or more, all while running straight up a slope. They were exposed, tired, and moving slower than they would on flat ground. Meanwhile, the Union defenders were positioned behind stone walls and hastily built earthworks at the top. They were relatively fresh, protected, and had a clear line of sight to fire down on the approaching enemy. Every step the Confederates took was a struggle against both enemy fire and gravity itself. This natural fortification made the Union lines exponentially harder to break. Another key factor is artillery. Cannons are the kings of the battlefield, and high ground is their throne. By placing their artillery batteries on Cemetery Hill and other high points, the Union could rain down fire on the Confederate lines with devastating effect. The cannons had a longer range and a better field of fire from above. They could hit troop formations, disrupt enemy advances, and provide crucial support to their own infantry. The Confederate artillery, positioned on lower ground, had a much harder time. They had to fire upwards, which reduced their range and effectiveness. Many of their shells would either fly harmlessly over the Union lines or bury themselves in the front slope of the hills. The Union's artillery dominance from the high ground created what is known as a kill zone in the fields below. This defensive position formed a shape that military historians now famously call the fish. Culp's Hill was the barb, Cemetery Hill was the curve, and Cemetery Ridge stretched south to form the long shank, ending at the hills known as Little Round Top and Big Round Top. This formation was a strategic masterpiece. It allowed the Union to hold a shorter, more concentrated defensive line. This meant they could move reinforcements quickly from one part of the line to another. If the Confederates attacked the right flank at Culp's Hill, troops from the center on Cemetery Ridge could be rushed over to help. This interior line advantage meant the Union Army could react faster and be more flexible than their Confederate counterparts, who had to cover a much longer exterior line to coordinate their attacks. Throughout the second and third days of the battle, Robert E. Lee would throw his Confederate forces against this formidable fishhook position. He attacked the left, he attacked the right, and he even launched a massive assault against the center in what became known as Pickett's Charge. But time and time again, the attacks were repulsed. The combination of superior observation, the defensive advantage of fighting uphill, the dominance of their artillery, and the flexibility of their interior lines made the Union position almost unbreakable. The Battle of Gettysburg is a timeless lesson in how geography can shape history. The Union soldiers who scrambled onto those hills on the evening of July 1st, 1863, might not have fully realized it at the moment, but they were securing the very ground that would lead to one of the most significant victories in American history. It wasn't just about fighting hard, it was about fighting smart, and at Gettysburg, the high ground was the key to everything. That wraps up our look at the strategic importance of the Union's position. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe for our next chapter, where we'll explore the brutal fighting on the second day of the battle. See you then. The sun rose on July 1st, 1863, casting long shadows across the rolling fields of Pennsylvania. For General Robert E. Lee, it was a day filled with a sense of audacious opportunity. His Army of Northern Virginia, a force forged in the fires of countless battles, had penetrated deeper into Union territory than ever before. They were an instrument of his will, hardened, confident, and, in his eyes, nearly invincible. Lee's confidence wasn't born of arrogance, but of experience. He had witnessed his men achieve the impossible time and again, from the 7 days' battles to He trusted his commander Longstreet, his old warhorse, the fiery A.P. Hill, the audacious cavalryman, Jeb Stuart. He believed in the spirit of the Southern soldier, their resilience, their elan, their fierce dedication to the cause. This belief was the bedrock of his strategy. However, as the day began, a fog of uncertainty hung over the Confederate high command, a fog more literal than the morning mist. Lee was effectively blind. His eyes and ears, Jeb Stuart's cavalry, were conspicuously absent, off on a controversial raid that had severed their connection to the main army. Without Stuart, Lee lacked crucial intelligence. Where was the Union Army? How strong were they? Were they concentrating their forces, or were they still scattered and vulnerable? These were questions that would make a more cautious commander halt, dig in, and wait. But Lee was not a cautious commander. He was a gambler, a man who understood that in war, audacity often reaped the greatest rewards. He felt the momentum was with him. The invasion had so far been a success, disrupting Union plans and bringing the war to the North's doorstep. To stop now, to lose the initiative, felt like a greater risk than pressing forward into the unknown. His orders for the day reflected this aggressive mindset. He instructed his corps to converge on the crossroads town of Gettysburg. The plan was not necessarily to fight a major battle there, but to concentrate his army threat in key northern cities like Harrisburg and Baltimore and force the Union Army of the Potomac into a battle on ground of his choosing. It was a strategy of calculated risk, predicated on the belief that his army could handle whatever it encountered. This belief was so profound that it bordered on faith. Lee had developed a near mystical trust in his men's fighting prowess. He believed they could defeat any Union force, even one with superior numbers. At Chancellorsville, he had split his much smaller army in the face of a larger enemy and won a stunning victory. Why should this time be any different? He saw the Army of the Potomac as a ponderous, slow-moving giant, led by a carousel of ever-changing, overly cautious generals. His own army, by contrast, was lean, agile, and accustomed to punching far above its weight. This confidence permeated the ranks. The soldiers of the Army of Northern Virginia marched with a swagger. They had left the scorched earths of Virginia behind and were now living off the fat of the Pennsylvanian land. Morale was sky-high. They shared their commander's belief in their own invincibility. They felt they were on the cusp of a war-winning victory, a single, decisive battle that would shatter Northern morale and secure Southern independence. Yet, this very confidence was a double-edged sword. It led Lee to underestimate his new opponent, General George Meade, who had taken command of the Union Army just days before, and it encouraged a certain carelessness, a willingness to engage the enemy before the full picture was clear. As elements of A.P. Hill's corps marched down the Chambersburg Pike toward Gettysburg that morning, they weren't expecting to start a major battle. They were looking for supplies, specifically shoes. What they found instead was Union cavalry, dug in on a series of ridges west of the town. The initial Confederate probe was repulsed. The skirmish escalated. More troops were fed into the fight by both sides. The small engagement for shoes was rapidly spiraling into a full-blown battle, a battle Lee had not planned for, on ground he had not chosen. Even as the sounds of battle grew louder, Lee's fundamental calculus didn't change. He rode toward the fighting, his mind racing. The reports were fragmented, but they all pointed to a growing engagement. A lesser general might have tried to disengage, to pull back and reassess. But for Lee, the scent of battle was intoxicating. An opportunity, unplanned as it was still an opportunity. He saw the Union forces, John Buford's dismounted cavalry, putting up a stubborn defense. He knew they were buying time. But for what? For the rest of their army to arrive and fortify the strong defensive ground south of Gettysburg, the hills and ridges that would soon bear names like Cemetery Hill and Culpess Hill. Lee's gamble now took a new form. His initial strategic gamble of invading the North had now become a tactical gamble on the fields of Gettysburg. Seeing the initial success of his troops as they began to push the Union the First Corps back, he made a fateful decision. He would commit his forces and press the attack. He would seize the town and the high ground if possible. He ordered his commanders to press those people and secure the heights. It was a decision driven by that same unshakable confidence. He saw the Union forces falling back, and he sensed a chance for a knockout blow on the very first day. If he could shatter this portion of the Union army and seize the dominant terrain, the rest of Meade's forces would be forced to attack him in an almost unassailable position. The decisive victory he dreamed of was right there, within his grasp. But the gamble was immense. He was committing his army to a major battle without knowing the full strength or disposition of his enemy. He was fighting on ground his opponent knew better than he did, and he was relying on his subordinates to execute his orders with a speed and precision that the chaos of battle rarely allows. His vague order to take the hill, if practicable, would become one of the most debated phrases of the entire war. As the sun began to set on that bloody first day, the Confederates had achieved a remarkable tactical victory. They had routed to Union corps and sent them streaming in disarray. Through the streets of Gettysburg, the town was theirs. But the high ground, the truly decisive ground south of town, remained in Union hands. The gamble had paid off, but not completely. Lee stood on Seminary Ridge, watching the Union troops rally on Cemetery Hill. The confidence was still there, but now it was tinged with the hard reality of the day's cost. His army had won, but it had bled, and the enemy, though beaten back, now held the position he had hoped to secure for himself. The stage was set. The gamble of July 1st had failed to win the war, and instead had locked the two great armies into a death grip. The greatest, bloodiest battle of the war was about to begin, all because of one man's supreme confidence in his army and his willingness to risk everything on a single throw of the dice. Welcome back to our series on the Battle of Gettysburg. Today, we're diving into the chaotic and pivotal second day, July 2nd, 1863. Imagine the scene. The sun rises on two massive armies, still reeling from the first day's clash. All through the night and into the morning, a frantic race is on. Soldiers are marching for miles, dusty and exhausted, converging on this small Pennsylvania town. Both sides know that whoever can bring up more men and get them into the right positions first will have a huge advantage. The Union Army, having been pushed back on July 1st, is scrambling to fortify a strong defensive line. Think of it like a giant fishhook. The line runs south from Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill, then down along a ridge called Cemetery Ridge, ending at two hills known as the Round Tops. This fishhook formation is a powerful defensive position, but only if they can get enough troops there to hold it. General Meade, the Union commander, is working tirelessly to plug gaps and strengthen this line. Meanwhile, the Confederate commander, General Lee, is planning his attack. He sees an opportunity. He believes the Union left flank, the very end of their line to the south, is weak and exposed. His plan is to launch a massive assault on that flank, roll it up like a carpet, and shatter the Union army. He gives this critical task to one of his most trusted generals, James Long. However, the attack doesn't start early in the morning as Lee had hoped. There are delays. Longstreet's divisions have to take a long, roundabout route to get into position without being seen by Union scouts perched on Little Round Top. This march is slow and grueling under the hot July sun. These delays give the Union Army precious hours to bring up more soldiers and strengthen their defenses. Just as the Confederates are finally getting into place, a major problem arises for the Union. One of their generals, Daniel Sickles, decides to move his entire corps forward, off of the high ground of Cemetery Ridge, and into a more exposed area that includes a peach orchard and a wheat field. He thinks this new position is better, but it creates a huge bulge in the Union line, disconnected from the rest of the army. He's essentially created a weak spot right where the Confederates are about to attack. Around Quatre Peme, the Confederate assault finally begins. Thousands of soldiers under Longstreet surge forward. The peaceful fields and woods erupt in a storm of battle. The fighting quickly engulfs Sickles' advanced position. Places with simple, peaceful names become legendary hotspots of combat. The peach orchard, the wheat field, and a rocky area called the Devil's Den. The fighting is incredibly confusing and desperate. Control of the wheat field changes hands multiple times in just a couple of hours. Regiments from both sides charged in, get cut to pieces, and are forced to retreat, only to be replaced by another wave of soldiers. It's a chaotic swirl of attack and counterattack. The Union line is bending and on the verge of breaking. As this is happening, one of the most famous actions of the battle unfolds at a hill called Little Round Top. This hill is at the very end of the Union line, and earlier in the day, it was left almost completely undefended. A Union staff officer, Gouverneur Warren, realizes the danger. If the Confederates capture this high ground, they can place their artillery there and fire down the entire length of the Union line. It would be a disaster. He frantically sends messages for reinforcements. Colonel Strawn Vincent, acting quickly, rushes his brigade up the rocky slopes of Little Round Top, arriving just moments before the Confederates. One of his regiments, the 20th Maine, commanded by a former professor named Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, is placed at the extreme left end of the entire Union Army. Their orders are simple. Hold this position at all costs. The 20th Maine faces wave after wave of attacks from determined Alabama troops. The fighting is fierce and at close range. After repelling several assaults, Chamberlain's men are running critically low on ammunition. They can't withstand another charge. In a moment of incredible bravery and quick thinking, Chamberlain makes a bold decision. He orders his men to fix bayonets and charge down the hill. This audacious, unexpected downhill charge completely surprises the attacking Confederates. Exhausted and caught off guard, they're thrown back, and many are captured. The 20th Maine has held the line. They have saved the Union flank. Their heroic stand on Little Round Top is one of the most celebrated moments of the entire war. While the fighting rages on the southern end of the battlefield, Lee launches other attacks to keep the Union Army from shifting reinforcements. He orders an assault on the Union center at Cemetery Ridge, and another on the Union right at Culpes Hill and East Cemetery Hill. The fighting at these locations is also intense, especially as dusk falls. On Culpes Hill, the battle continues in the darkness, a confusing and terrifying struggle among the trees and rocks. As the sun sets on July 2nd, the battlefield falls into a tense unia, broken only by the cries of the wounded. Both armies are battered and exhausted. The Union line has been stretched and pushed, but it has not broken. The Confederates have made some gains, capturing the Peach Orchard and Devil's Den, but they failed to achieve their main objective of collapsing the Union flank or seizing the critical high ground of Cemetery Ridge and Little Round Top. The second day of Gettysburg is over, and it has been even bloodier than the first. Tens of thousands of men are now casualties. The stage is set for a third and final day. Lee's army is still a formidable force, and he is not ready to admit defeat. Meade's army has held on, but they are hanging by a thread. Everyone knows the next day will decide the outcome of this monumental battle. Thank you for joining us for this look at the second day of Gettysburg. The strategic movements and desperate struggles on this day set the stage for the famous climax of the battle. Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter, where we'll cover the climactic final day and the legendary Pickett's charge. Thanks for watching. Hey O'Brien, and welcome back to our deep dive into Michael Schra's masterpiece, The Killer Angels. Today, we're retackling one of the most pivotal and breathtaking chapters in the entire book. Chapter 10, The Defense of Little Round Top. If you thought the tension was high before, just wait. This chapter is a masterclass in how a seemingly small action can have monumental consequences, literally turning the tide of the entire Civil War. So, let's set the stage. It's the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863. The second day of the Battle of Gettysburg is raging. The Union line, shaped like a fishhook, is under immense pressure. Down at the southern end of that line, there's a critical vulnerability, a weak spot that could unravel everything. The Union's left flank is completely exposed, or in the air, as they'd say, and perched right there, overlooking the entire battlefield, are two hills, Big Round Top and the smaller, but far more strategic, Little Round Top. From the Confederate perspective, General Longstreet, Lee's old warhorse, seized the opportunity. His divisions, led by Hood and McLaws, are marching to attack this very flank. If they can seize Little Round Top, they can place their artillery up there and rain fire down upon the entire Union line, shattering it from the side and back. It would be a catastrophic, battle-ending disaster for the Union Army. But here's where fate and a sharp-eyed engineer step in. General Gouverneur K. Warren, the Union Army's chief of engineers, is sent to the hill to assess the situation. When he gets to the summit of Little Round Top, his blood runs cold. It's practically undefended. He sees the glint of sunlight of thousands of Confederate bayonets in the woods below, a massive force moving to take this exact position. He knows he has only minutes, maybe seconds, to act. This is the moment the chapter hinges on. Warren doesn't hesitate. He frantically sends aides galloping off in every direction, begging for any available troops. He knows that whoever holds this high ground holds the key to the day's battle, and perhaps the war itself. It's a race against time, a desperate scramble to plug a gaping hole in the dam before the floodwaters burst through. And who answers the call? The first to arrive is a brigade from the Union, the 5th Corps. commanded by Colonel Strong Vincent. Vincent is a young, intelligent officer who immediately grasps the gravity of the situation. Without waiting for direct orders from his superiors, he takes the initiative. He sees the danger, understands the stakes, and diverts his entire brigade for regiments to rush up the rocky, wooded slopes of Little Round Top. He knows he's probably disobeying the chain of command, but he also knows that if he doesn't, there won't be a Union left flank to defend. Vincent places his men strategically along the southern face of the hill, forming a thin line of defense, just as the first wave of Confederates from Houda's division begins its assault. His regiments are from Michigan, Pennsylvania, New York, and, most famously, the 20th Maine. Each man knows that they are the absolute end of the line. There is nothing and no one behind them. If they break, the battle is lost. The fighting that erupts is some of the most brutal and desperate of the entire war. We see it unfold through the eyes of the men on the ground. They're not fighting for grand ideals in that moment. They're fighting for the man next to them, for the few feet of ground they stand on. The Confederates, mostly Texans and Alabamians, are just as determined. They charge up the hill again and again, clawing their way over boulders and through thickets, only to be thrown back by withering Union fire. Casualties are horrific on both sides. Men fall, ammunition runs low, and the smoke is so thick they can barely see the enemy in front of them. Colonel Vincent himself is mortally wounded while rallying his men, shouting, "Don't give an inch." His sacrifice underscores the sheer cost of holding this ground. And then we come to the far left of Vincent's line, the very end of the entire Union Army. Here, Colonel Joshua Laureen, Chamberlain, and his 20th Maine Regiment are holding a position that seems impossible to defend. Chamberlain, a former professor of rhetoric from Bowdoin College, is an unlikely hero, but on this hill, his academic mind becomes a brilliant tactical weapon. His men repelled charge after charge from the determined 15th Alabama. The fighting is hand-to-hand, vicious and personal. They use their rifles as clubs. They throw rocks, anything to hold the line. But soon, their ammunition is almost completely gone. Chamberlain faces a terrible choice: retreat and doom the army, or be overrun where they stand. And in this moment of extreme crisis, he makes a decision that has become legendary. With no bullets left, he orders his men to fix bayonets. But instead of just holding their ground, he orders them to charge. It's a move of stunning audacity, the last thing the exhausted Confederates expect. The 20th Maine, with a final, desperate roar, swings down the hill like a door closing, sweeping the shocked Alabamians before them and saving the flank. This single, decisive action, a bayonet charge, born of desperation, secures Little Round Top for the Union. The Confederate assault on the left flank is broken. The immediate crisis is over. Shara brilliantly captures the chaos, the fear, and the incredible courage of these moments. He shows us how history isn't just made by generals moving pins on a map, but by the split-second decisions and raw bravery of individuals like Warren, Vincent, and Chamberlain. The defense of Little Round Top is a microcosm of the entire Battle of Gettysburg. It was a close-run thing, a battle that could have gone either way at multiple points. It highlights the importance of initiative, of seeing an opportunity or a danger and acting on it without hesitation. It shows how the actions of a few hundred men on a rocky hill in Pennsylvania could ripple outwards to affect the fate of a nation. This chapter is a powerful reminder that victory and defeat often hang by the thinnest of threads. The quick response to protect that exposed flank wasn't just a small tactical victory. It was the anchor that held the Union line together on July 2nd, setting the stage for the final day of battle and the ultimate Union victory at Gettysburg. Thanks so much for joining me for this analysis of Chapter 10. The action and drama just keep escalating from here. If you're enjoying this series, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you then. Welcome back to our series. Today, we're diving into Chapter 11, The Strain on Both Sides. We often focus on the grand strategies and decisive battles of war. But what about the human cost? The relentless pressure that grinds down soldiers and commanders alike? That's what this chapter is all about. It peels back the layers of battlefield glory to reveal the raw, exhausting reality of prolonged conflict. Imagine being a soldier on the front lines. The physical toll is immense. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months. You're constantly on alert, living with the gnawing uncertainty of what the next hour might bring. Sleep is a luxury, often stolen in short, fitful bursts. A proper meal becomes a distant memory, replaced by whatever rations can be scrounged. The weather becomes another enemy, biting cold, scorching heat, or relentless rain that soaks you to the bone and turns trenches into muddy graves. Your body is pushed to its absolute limit, day in and day out. This physical exhaustion is a constant companion, a heavy weight that never leaves. But the mental strain is perhaps even more corrosive. The constant exposure to danger, the loss of comrades, the sheer horror of combat, all chips away at your psyche. Soldiers aren't machines. They're human beings grappling with fear, grief, and homesickness. The psychological pressure is immense. This is what we now understand as combat stress or PTSD. But back then, it was often dismissed as shell shock or a lack of moral fiber. Yet, it was a very real and debilitating condition. The mind, just like the body, can only endure so much before it starts to break. The bravery we admire in soldiers isn't the absence of fear, it's the ability to function despite it, a feat that takes an unimaginable toll over time. This immense strain wasn't limited to the soldiers in the trenches. The commanders, the men making the life and death decisions, were also under incredible pressure. From a distance, it's easy to criticize their choices, to see them as unfeeling figures, moving pieces on a map. But the reality was far more complex. They bore the weight of thousands of lives on their shoulders. Every decision, every order, had profound consequences. Imagine being a general, miles behind the front. You're poring over maps, trying to make sense of incomplete and often contradictory reports. You send an order, knowing it will send men into harm's way, and you wait. You wait for hours, sometimes days, for news of the outcome. Did the attack succeed? How many casualties? The responsibility is crushing. They had to balance strategic objectives with the welfare of their troops, often making impossible choices with limited information. Many commanders suffered from severe stress, insomnia, and the psychological burden of their command. They were just as trapped by the war as their soldiers, albeit in a different kind of trench one, made of maps, reports, and the heavy mantle of responsibility. A huge part of this strain, for both commanders and soldiers, was the problem of communication. Today, we have instant, real-time communication. But in the eras we're often discussing, that simply didn't exist. Imagine a battle line stretching for dozens, even hundreds of miles. How do you coordinate troop movements effectively? How do you get critical information from the front line back to headquarters in a timely manner? The methods were slow and unreliable. Runners, or dispatch riders, had to physically carry messages, braving enemy fire and treacherous terrain. A runner getting captured or killed could mean a vital order never arrives. Field telephones were a step up, but the lines were fragile. A single artillery shell could sever communication, plunging a whole sector into silence and chaos. Pigeons were used, flares were fired, but each method had its own severe limitations. This communication lag created a fog of war that was thick and suffocating. Commanders were often making decisions based on information that was hours, or even days, old. By the time an order reached the front, the situation on the ground could have changed completely. An order to attack a seemingly weak point might send soldiers into a now heavily fortified position. This breakdown in communication led to missed opportunities, tactical blunders, and tragically, unnecessary loss of life. For the soldiers, this unreliability was terrifying. It meant they could be cut off, isolated, and left to fend for themselves, with no idea if reinforcements were coming or if their commanders even knew their predicament. It fostered a sense of being a small, insignificant cog in a vast, uncaring machine. This combination of physical exhaustion, psychological trauma, and a constant friction of poor communication created a grinding process of attrition that was not just about numbers of soldiers or pieces of equipment. It was an attrition of the human spirit. Both sides were locked in this grueling struggle, with their capacity to endure being tested every single moment. As one side's morale and cohesion began to crack, The other might see an opportunity, but more often than not, both sides were simply being worn down simultaneously. This chapter reminds us that victory in war isn't just about brilliant tactics or superior numbers. It's often about which side can withstand the strain the longest. It's about the resilience of the individual soldier, the fortitude of the commander, and the robustness of the entire military system under almost unbearable pressure. The logistics of supply, the care of the wounded, the rotation of troops, all of these unglamorous aspects of warfare become absolutely critical. When these systems break down, the army's ability to fight collapses, regardless of how many soldiers it has left. Understanding this mutual strain is key to understanding the nature of prolonged conflicts. It's not a clean, linear process. It's messy, chaotic, and deeply human. It's a testament to the incredible endurance people can show, but also a stark reminder of the horrific cost of war, a cost measured not just in lives lost, but in bodies and minds broken by the relentless grinding pressure of the fight. It shows that, in many ways, the greatest enemy wasn't the opposing army, but exhaustion, despair, and the fog of war itself. Thanks for joining me for this look into the human cost of conflict. It's a heavy topic, but essential for a true understanding of history. If you found this insightful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series. We've reached a pivotal moment in our story. The night of July 2nd, sun has set on another day of unimaginable carnage at Gettysburg. A strange, eerie quiet has descended upon the fields and hills, a silence made all the more profound by the echoes of the day's fury. This is Chapter 12. Nightfall before the final day. Imagine the scene. The smoke from thousands of rifles and cannons still hangs heavy in the humid air, mixing with the scent of damp earth and something far more grim. The moon, when it breaks through the clouds, illuminates a landscape transformed. Familiar fields have become graveyards, and tranquil woods now hide thousands of wounded and weary men. For the soldiers on both sides, there is no real rest, only a brief, haunted pause. Throughout the Union lines, stretching from Culp's Hill, along Cemetery Ridge, and down to the Round Tops, there's a constant, low hum of activity. Shovels scrape against rock as men dig in, deepening their trenches and strengthening their stone walls. The sound is a testament to their resolve. They've held their ground, but at a terrible cost. They know the fight isn't over. Couriers on horseback gallop through the darkness, carrying dispatches from one commander to another. The flickering lights of lanterns reveal surgeons working tirelessly in makeshift field hospitals. The barns and farmhouses behind the lines now filled with the suffering. For every soldier trying to catch a few moments of sleep, there are dozens more tending to the wounded, carrying water or standing guard, their eyes straining into the darkness, listening for any sign of movement from the Confederate lines. Hinnett Almeida, the Union commander, is holding a council of war at his headquarters, the small Leicester farmhouse. The mood is somber but determined. He pulls his generals one by one. Do they stay and fight, or do they retreat? The answer is unanimous. Stay. Fight. This is the ground they will defend to the last. There's a shared understanding in that room that the next day, Huli Tresseradi will likely decide the fate of the battle, and perhaps the entire war. The decision is made. They will hold this fishhook-shaped line, no matter what comes at dawn. Across the valley, in the Confederate camp, a similar tension grips the air. General Lee's army has pushed the Union forces back on both flanks, but they have failed to break their lines. The day was a story of near successes and brutal fighting, but victory remained just out of reach. The Confederate soldiers, exhausted and depleted, are also using the cover of darkness. They are reorganizing their units, which have been shattered and mixed during the day's chaotic assaults. They replenish their ammunition, tend to their own wounded, and wonder what their brilliant commander, Robert E. Lee, has planned for the morning. Lee himself is a figure of intense focus. He is convinced that one more push, one more grand assault, can shatter the Union center and win him the battle. He believes his men are invincible, that they can accomplish anything he asks of them. Despite the concerns of some of his subordinates, like General Longstreet, who argues for a defensive strategy, Lee is resolute. His mind is already formulating the plan for what will become one of the most famous and tragic military actions in American history. He will target the Union center on Cemetery Ridge. He believes it to be the weakest point. It's a gamble, a massive, audacious roll of the dice, and he is preparing to stake everything on it. For the common soldier, these grand strategies are unknown. Their world is the few feet of ground around them. A Confederate soldier from North Carolina might be sharing his last piece of hardtack with a comrade, talking softly about home, wondering if he'll ever see it again. A Union soldier from Pennsylvania, perhaps defending the very state where he was born, writes a hurried letter to his family by the light of a small fire, the words smudged with dirt and fatigue. He tries to sound brave, but the fear is a cold knot in his stomach. This night is filled with such personal moments, thousands of them, played out under the same starry sky. The air is thick with prayers, with whispers, with the groans of the wounded that drift across the no man's land between the two armies. These aren't just faceless armies. They are collections of individuals, farmers, blacksmiths, teachers, and clerks, all caught up in this whirlwind of history. They are tired, they are hungry, and they're scared. But they are also filled with a sense of duty and a grim determination. They know tomorrow is coming, and with it, the final, decisive test. As the hours of the night tick by, the sounds of preparation continue. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer repairing a cannon wheel, the quiet orders of a sergeant positioning his pickets, the nervous whinny of a horse sensing the tension in the air. Both armies are coiling springs, gathering their strength for the final, violent release. The landscape of Gettysburg is holding its breath. The fields, the ridges, the woods all are waiting. The stage is set for the third and final act of this epic tragedy. The calm is deceptive. It is deep silent intake of breath before the deafening roar. Nightfall is not an end, but a prelude. It's the quiet darkness before a dawn that will change America forever. Thank you for joining me for this chapter. The events of July 3rd are almost upon us, and the climax of the battle is drawing near. If you found this journey through history meaningful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue to tell these important stories. We'll see you next time for the final day at Gettysburg. The air on the morning of July 3rd, 1863, was thick with humidity and the grim stench of battle. For 2 days, the fields around Gettysburg had been soaked in blood. As Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia clashed with George Meade's Army of the Potomac, the first day had been a Confederate success, pushing the Union forces back through the town and onto the high ground south of it. Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and the long, fishhook-shaped Cemetery Ridge. The second day was a whirlwind of savage combat. Lee had launched massive assaults on both Union flanks, trying to dislodge them from their formidable defensive positions. The fighting at Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the wheat field, and the peach orchard became legendary for its ferocity. On the Union right, the struggle for Culp's Hill raged into the night, but by the time the guns fell silent, the Union line, though battered and bruised, held firm. The Confederates had gained some ground, but they had failed to break the Federal Army. Now, as dawn broke on the third day, Lee faced a critical decision. His army was weary, and his casualties were mounting. His most trusted subordinate, James Longstreet, argued for a strategic maneuver. He urged Lee to disengage, swing the army around the Union left flank, and find a strong defensive position between Meade's army and Washington, D.C. This would force Meade to abandon his high ground and attack the Confederates on their own terms. It was a sound, logical plan, one that played to the Confederate Army's strengths, but Lee was not in a mood for maneuvering. He was a man of aggressive instinct, a commander who believed in the decisive, knockout blow. He had come to Pennsylvania to fight and win a climactic battle, one that could potentially end the war. He could feel victory was within his grasp. He believed the Union Army was on the verge of collapse. He reasoned that since he had attacked both of Meade's flanks on the second day, the Union commander must have weakened his center to reinforce them. Lee saw the Union center, stretched along the lower part of Cemetery Ridge, as the vulnerable point. It was a classic military calculation. Hit your enemy where they are weakest. He envisioned a grand, concentrated assault, a massive column of his best infantry, punching straight through the middle of the Union line. It would be a blow that would shatter the Army of the Potomac, sending it reeling in defeat and opening the road to Washington. He believed his Virginians were invincible, capable of achieving anything he asked of them. This conviction, born of past victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, clouded his judgment. He dismissed Longstreet's cautious advice. The plan was set. He would not maneuver. He would attack. The target was a small copse of trees on Cemetery Ridge, a landmark that would guide the assaulting column. To lead this monumental charge, Lee chose 3 divisions. 2 were from A.P. Hill's corps, commanded by Generals Johnston Pettigrew and Isaac Trimble. But the main striking force, the core of the assault, would be a fresh division from Longstreet's corps, commanded by Major General George Pickett. Pickett's Virginians had arrived late on the second day and had seen almost no action. They were rested, eager, and considered among the elite troops of the entire Confederate Army. In total, around 12,500 men would be tasked with crossing nearly a mile of open, gently rising farmland, all under the direct fire of Union artillery and infantry securely positioned behind a low stone wall. Longstreet was appalled. He had seen the strength of the Union position firsthand. He knew what it was like to attack entrenched infantry across open ground. He had watched Union brigades get slaughtered doing the same thing at Fredericksburg. He argued passionately with Lee, pleading with him to reconsider. "General," he reportedly said, "I have been a soldier all my life. I have been with soldiers engaged in fights by couples, by squads, companies, regiments, divisions, and armies, and should know, as well as anyone, what soldiers can do. It is my opinion that number 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position." But Lee's mind was made up. His faith in his men and his plan was absolute. He gently, but firmly, overruled his most capable general. The order was given. To prepare the way for the infantry, Lee planned the largest artillery bombardment ever seen on the North American continent. Over 150 Confederate cannons were wheeled into position along Seminary Ridge, directly opposite the Union center on Cemetery Ridge. The idea was to pulverize the Union artillery on the ridge and demoralize the infantry hunkered down behind the stone wall. The Confederate artillery chief, Colonel Edward Porter Alexander, was tasked with coordinating this massive campaign. He was also given the heavy responsibility of judging when the Union guns had been sufficiently silenced to signal the infantry to advance. It was a task that weighed heavily on him, as he knew thousands of lives depended on his judgment. Across the field, on Cemetery Ridge, the Union commanders anticipated the blow. General Meade, a cautious and methodical engineer, had correctly guessed that after filling on the flanks, Lee's next logical move would be an attack on the center. He and his corps commander, General Winfield Scott Hancock, whose the Second Corps held the center of the line, worked to strengthen their defenses. They shifted troops, consolidated their artillery, and made sure their men had ample ammunition. They knew an attack was coming. They just didn't know exactly when or with what force. The men of the Union, the Second Corps, lay behind their stone wall, nervously watching the silent Confederate line on the opposite ridge, waiting for the storm to break. And so, the stage was set for one of the most famous and tragic events in American history. It was a decision born of Lee's supreme confidence, his aggressive nature, and a critical underestimation of his enemy's resilience and the strength of their position. He was betting everything on a single, audacious roll of the dice. He was convinced that his plan would deliver the decisive victory the Confederacy so desperately needed. As the morning wore on and the sun climbed higher, a tense, ominous silence fell over the battlefield. The fate of the battle, and perhaps the war itself, now hinged on this final, desperate charge. Lee's final decision had been made. The only thing left was to see it through to its bloody conclusion. What would follow would be forever known as Pickett's Charge, a moment of incredible bravery and devastating sacrifice that would echo through the ages. Thank you for watching. If you found this chapter of history compelling, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the pivotal moments of the past. We'll see you in the next one. Welcome back to our journey through the Battle of Gettysburg. Today, in Chapter 14, we witness one of the most famous and dramatic moments in American history: Pickett's Charge. It's the morning of July 3rd, 1863. For 2 long, grueling days, the armies have clashed around this small Pennsylvania town. The air is thick with anticipation. Confederate General Robert E. Lee believes that a massive, direct assault on the center of the Union line can break his opponent and win the battle, perhaps even the war. The target is a specific point on Cemetery Ridge, a modest elevation held by Union forces. Lee gathers his finest divisions for this monumental task. Under the overall command of General James Longstreet, about 12,000 Confederate soldiers are assembled. They represent the flower of the Army of Northern Virginia, including the fresh division of General George Pickett, which is why the charge forever bears his name. But Lee's trusted subordinate, General Longstreet, is deeply troubled. He looks across the vast, open ground the men will have to cross nearly a mile of fields, exposed to the enemy's watchful eyes. He sees the formidable Union position, dug in behind stone walls and supported by a massive array of artillery. To him, the plan feels like a desperate gamble, sending brave men into an almost impossible situation. He argues against it, but Lee's mind is made up. The order is given. Before the infantry can move, one of the largest artillery bombardments of the entire war erupts. Over 150 Confederate cannons opened fire, aiming to shatter the Union center and silence their guns. The goal is to soften the defenses, to pave the way for the infantry. On the other side, the Union artillery, numbering around 100 cannons, answers with equal fury. For nearly 2 hours, the valley between the two armies is filled with a deafening roar. The ground trembles, and the air is choked with smoke, obscuring the battlefield in a thick, gray haze. From a distance, it's a terrifying spectacle of power. But for the soldiers on both sides, it's an ordeal of survival, hugging the earth as iron shells scream overhead and explode all around them. The Union artillery chief, General Henry Hunt, makes a clever decision to conserve ammunition for the inevitable infantry attack and to trick the Confederates into thinking their barrage was successful. He orders his guns to gradually fall silent. Seeing the Union fire slacken, the Confederate commanders believe their artillery has done its job. The time has come. Colonel Edward Porter Alexander, in charge of the Confederate artillery, sends a fateful message to Longstreet. "For God's sake, come quick, or my ammunition will not let me support you properly." This is the moment of truth. General Longstreet, with a heavy heart, cannot bring himself to give the verbal order. He simply notes, and General Pickett, ever eager, accepts the signal. "General, I shall lead my division forward," he says, and rides off to give the command. And so it begins. Just after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the lines of Confederate soldiers emerge from the cover of the woods on Seminary Ridge. They step out into the open fields, a breathtaking and terrifying sight. In perfect parade ground order, they form a line of battle over a mile wide, with flags unfurled and bayonets gleaming in the summer sun. They begin their slow, deliberate march toward Cemetery Ridge. Imagine the scene. 12,000 men, walking shoulder to shoulder, advancing across open ground under the hot July sun. They have to cross fences and navigate uneven terrain, all while maintaining their disciplined formations. Their objective is a small clump of trees on the horizon, marking the center of the Union line. It looks deceptively close, but is a journey across a valley of death. On Cemetery Ridge, the Union soldiers watch in stunned silence. They can see the entire Confederate force laid out before them. The initial awe at the spectacle quickly turns to grim determination. They had withstood the bombardment, and now they brace themselves for the human wave rolling toward them. Union General Winfield Scott Hancock rides along the lines, his presence inspiring confidence and courage in his men. They are ordered to hold their fire, to wait until the enemy is within effective range. The tension is almost unbearable. The Confederate advance is a study in courage. As they march, Union artillery, which had only feigned silence, roars back to life. Shells begin to tear through the advancing ranks, creating gaps in the perfectly dressed lines. But with incredible discipline, the Confederate soldiers close the gaps and continue their steady, relentless march forward. The rebel yell, their famous battle cry, echoes across the field as they press on, a wave of gray and butternut moving toward the blue line on the ridge. The men in Pickett's division, along with those from the divisions of Johnston, Pettigrew, and Isaac Trimble, are stepping into history. They are marching with a belief in their cause and an unwavering trust in their leaders. Each step brings them closer to the enemy, closer to the stone wall, and closer to a destiny that would be debated for generations. This is the high tide of the Confederacy, a moment of supreme effort and sacrifice, as thousands of men walk across an open field toward a wall of fire, driven by a conviction that would define an era. The world seems to hold its breath as they cross the Emmitsburg Road. The halfway point, the most intense part of the struggle, is about to begin. The fate of the battle, and perhaps the nation, hangs in the balance, resting on the shoulders of these soldiers marching into the heart of the storm. Thank you for watching. In our next chapter, we will follow the charge to its dramatic and fateful conclusion on the slopes of Cemetery Ridge. If you're finding this series meaningful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more chapters from history. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to our series. We've reached a pivotal moment, a turning point where everything hangs in the balance. The air is thick with smoke, the ground trembles with cannon fire, and the fate of a nation is being decided on this bloody field. This is Chapter 15. The Union holds the line. After a series of relentless assaults, the Union Army is pushed to its absolute limit. They are battered, exhausted, and stretched thin. But retreat is not an option. What happens next will not only define this battle, but will echo through the annals of history. How does an army on the brink of collapse find the strength to stand firm against an overwhelming tide? It comes down to two critical factors: the ground beneath their feet and the leaders who refuse to yield. Let's start with the terrain. The Union had secured the high ground early on, and this advantage became their salvation. Imagine trying to charge uphill under a constant hail of bullets and shrapnel, with every step draining your energy. That's what the Confederate forces faced. The Union soldiers, positioned along ridges and behind stone walls, had a clear line of sight and natural cover. These defensive positions weren't just random, they were strategic strongholds. Places like Cemetery Ridge and Culp's Hill became fortresses. From these heights, Union artillery could rain down devastating fire on the approaching columns, breaking up formations before they even got close. The physical landscape itself became a powerful ally, a silent partner in the Union's defense, forcing the attackers to pay a heavy price for every inch of ground they gained. It created a kill zone that was almost impossible to cross. But a strong position is useless without the will to hold it. This is where leadership made all the difference. While the overall command structure had been tested, at the corps and division level, Union officers rose to the occasion. Men like General Winfield Scott Hancock were everywhere, a constant, reassuring presence on the battlefield. He rode along the lines, plugging gaps, redirecting regiments, and inspiring his men with his own incredible bravery. He understood the tactical situation in real time, making split-second decisions that saved entire sections of the line from collapsing. His ability to anticipate the enemy's moves and shift reinforcements to the most threatened points was nothing short of brilliant. He wasn't just directing from the rear. He was at the very heart of the fighting, a visible symbol of unbreakable resolve. It wasn't just the generals, either. Colonels and captains on the ground took incredible initiative. Take the story of the 20th Maine, for example. Positioned at the extreme left flank of the entire Union Army on a hill called Little Round Top, Colonel Joshua Chamberlain knew that if his position fell, the entire line could be rolled up. After repelling wave after wave of attacks, his men were nearly out of ammunition. The situation was desperate. In a moment of pure tactical genius and sheer audacity, Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge. Instead of waiting to be overrun, his men charged downhill. A screaming, desperate wave of blue that shocked and shattered the exhausted Confederate attackers. This single, decisive action secured the flank, and may have saved the entire army. It's a perfect example of how individual leadership, at the right moment, can change the course of history. Coordination was the glue that held it all together. Runners risked their lives carrying messages between units, while signalmen on high points used flags to communicate across the battlefield. This flow of information allowed commanders to maintain a cohesive defensive front. When one part of the line began to buckle, reserves were dispatched with remarkable speed. Artillery batteries were given new targets, shifting their fire to support the infantry where it was needed most. This wasn't a series of isolated fights. It was a coordinated, living defense. Every part of the army worked in concert, supporting each other. If a regiment was forced to fall back, another would move to cover its withdrawal. This elasticity, this ability to bend without breaking, was a testament to the discipline and training of the Union soldiers and the competence of their officers. The psychological aspect was also huge. Holding a strong defensive position gives soldiers a powerful mental advantage. They feel more secure, more in control. As they watched repeated enemy charges break against their lines, their confidence grew. Each failed assault reinforced their belief that they could hold. They were fighting on their home turf, defending their land, and that gave them a powerful sense of purpose. For the common soldier, seeing their comrades to the left and right holding firm, seeing their leaders sharing the danger, and seeing the enemy falter again and again, created a powerful feedback loop of courage and determination. They drew strength from each other, their collective will becoming an unbreakable barrier. Let's zoom in on the artillery's role. The Union's artillery arm was superbly managed during this phase of the battle. Chief of Artillery, General Henry Hunt, had organized his cannons into a flexible and powerful force. He massed his guns at critical points, creating what were essentially walls of fire. When the final, massive Confederate assault, known as Pickett's charge, began, Hunt had his batteries hold their fire until the enemy was at the perfect range. Then, he unleashed a coordinated barrage that was simply apocalyptic. The cannons ripped huge holes in the advancing lines, staggering the charge before it even reached the Union infantry. This masterful use of artillery was a decisive factor. It broke the back of the attack and exemplified the Union's superior organization and use of its material advantages. So, when we look back at this crucial chapter, it's a story of resilience. The Union held the line not through a single act of heroism, but through a combination of factors, all working in synergy. They had the defensive advantage of high ground, which tired out the attackers and gave them cover. They had inspired and adaptive leaders at every level, from corps commanders like Hancock to regimental leaders like Chamberlain, who made brilliant decisions under fire. They had a coordinated system that allowed them to shift resources and support weak points effectively. And finally, they had the psychological edge, the growing belief that they could not be broken. It was this powerful combination that turned the tide. The lean bent, it cracked in places, but it never broke. The Union held. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into one of history's most critical moments. Understanding how and why the line held is key to understanding the entire conflict. If you found this analysis interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more. We've got more chapters to cover, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Drop a comment below with your thoughts, and we'll see you in the next video. Welcome back to our deep dive into the Battle of Gettysburg. Today, we're tackling Chapter 16. The turning point, and a moment that sealed the fate of the Confederacy, the failure of Pickett's charge. The stage was set. After a massive artillery bombardment that shook the very ground, nearly 13,000 Confederate soldiers stepped out from the tree line of Seminary Ridge. Their target, a small clump of trees on Cemetery Ridge, almost a mile away, defended by entrenched Union forces. Leading this grand, desperate assault were Generals Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble. Imagine the scene, a line of men stretching over a mile long, flags flying, marching with grim determination across open fields. It was a spectacle of military pageantry, but it was also a death march. Union artillery, which the Confederates mistakenly believed had been silenced, opened up with devastating effect. Canister shot, essentially giant shotgun shells, tore horrific gaps in the advancing lines. The men had to climb over fences, exposing themselves to even more fire. As they crossed the Emmitsburg Road, the Confederate ranks began to falter. But they didn't break. They closed the gaps and pressed on, a testament to their incredible bravery. The Union infantry, waiting patiently behind a low stone wall, held their fire until the Confederates were just yards away. When they finally unleashed their volley, the effect was cataclysmic. The front ranks of the charging force simply vanished in a cloud of smoke and fire. Despite the carnage, a small contingent of Confederates, led by General Lewis Armistead, actually breached the Union line at a point known as the Angela. Armistead, with his hat on the tip of his sword, led his men over the stone wall in a final, heroic push. For a few frantic moments, it seemed they might just succeed. They captured a Union cannon and engaged in brutal, hand-to-hand combat. This was the high-water mark of the Confederacy, the closest they would ever come to winning the Civil War. But it was a fleeting moment. Union reinforcements rushed to the scene, overwhelming the small band of attackers. Armistead was mortally wounded, and his men were killed, captured, or forced to retreat. The Union line held firm. The charge was broken. What followed was a harrowing retreat back across that same open field, a journey even more perilous than the advance. The ground was littered with the dead and wounded. Of the thousands who started the charge, less than half made it back to their own lines. When the survivors straggled back, General Lee rode out to meet them. He took full responsibility, famously saying, "It is all my fault." He knew the gamble had failed. The charge was not just a tactical defeat. It was a devastating psychological blow. The Army of Northern Virginia, once seen as invincible, had been decisively repulsed. Its offensive power was shattered. The failure of Pickett's charge on July 3, 1863, marked the definitive turning point of the battle, and many historians argue the entire war. The Confederacy's momentum was not just halted, it was reversed. From this point on, they would be fighting a defensive war, a slow, grinding retreat toward their eventual surrender. The hope of a decisive victory on Northern soil was gone, lost in the smoke and chaos of that Pennsylvania field. This chapter is a powerful reminder of the brutal realities of war and the incredible courage of the soldiers on both sides. The charge was a catastrophe born of desperation, a final, bloody roll of the dice that came up short. It stands as a pivotal moment in American history, where the tide of the Civil War turned for good, right there at the stone wall on Cemetery Ridge. Thank you so much for joining me for this analysis of Chapter 16. It is a heavy but crucial part of the story. If you found this breakdown insightful, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know your thoughts on Pickett's charge in the comments below. We'll see you in the next video. The cannons have fallen silent, the smoke is cleared, and the fields of Pennsylvania are soaked in the blood of a nation divided. The Army of Northern Virginia, once seemingly invincible, is in full retreat. Welcome back to our series on the Civil War. This is Chapter 17, Aftermath, A Changed War. The morning of July 4th, 1863, must have been a surreal sight. Independence Day, a celebration of the nation's birth, dawned over a battlefield littered with the dead and dying. For the Union Army of the Potomac, it was a day of grim victory. They had held the line. For General Robert E. Lee and his Confederates, it was the beginning of a long, agonizing journey home. The retreat wasn't just a tactical withdrawal. It was a profound turning point in the entire conflict. This wasn't just a lost battle. It was the end of an era for the Confederacy. Never again would the Army of Northern Virginia mount an offensive of this scale. The grand invasions, the bold gambles to take the war to the north and force a political settlement, were over. From this moment forward, the strategic initiative would belong almost exclusively to the Union. Imagine the scene, a 17-mile-long wagon train of wounded men, groaning and suffering with every jolt of the wheels, stretched across the landscape. The rain began to fall, turning the roads into a muddy quagmire, adding to the misery. This was the ambulance train, a horrifying testament to the carnage of the past 3 days. Lee, riding among his men, looked not like a conquering hero, but a leader weighed down by the immense gravity of his defeat. He took personal responsibility, telling his subordinates, "It is I who have lost this fight." This shift was both psychological and material. The losses were staggering. The Confederacy had poured its finest men and resources into this campaign, and the cost was catastrophic. Pickett's charge, the final, desperate assault on the third day, had gutted some of its best Virginia regiments. They lost not just soldiers, but experienced officers and irreplaceable leadership. These were men who couldn't be easily replaced. The South simply didn't have the population or the industrial base to absorb such losses and bounce back in the same way the North could. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the news was met with a mixture of relief and frustration. President Abraham Lincoln was overjoyed that Lee's invasion had been repelled, but he was also deeply disappointed that General Meade didn't pursue and destroy the retreating Confederate army. Lincoln believed this was a golden opportunity to end the war right then and there. He famously lamented, "Our army held the war in the hollow of their hand, and they would not close it." Meade's caution is understandable, though. His own army was battered and exhausted. The Union had suffered over 23,000 casualties themselves. The commanders were tired, the men were spent, and the logistical challenges of a rapid pursuit were immense. So, Meade followed. But he didn't attack with the ferocity Lincoln craved. Lee's army, cornered at the Potomac River, which was swollen by the rains, managed to build pontoon bridges and slip back into the relative safety of Virginia. The chance was lost, but even with Lee's escape, the strategic landscape had been irrevocably altered. The victory at Gettysburg, coupled with the fall of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River on the very same day, Huli Quattro Teache, was a double blow from which the Confederacy would never recover. The capture of Vicksburg split the South in two, cutting off vital supplies from Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana. Gettysburg had shattered the offensive power of its premier army in the East. The war was far from over. In fact, some of its bloodiest fighting still lay ahead in 1864 and 1865. But the nature of that fighting would be different. For the Army of Northern Virginia, the war would now be one of defense, of attrition, of holding on against an enemy with overwhelming advantages in manpower and material. Lee would display his defensive genius time and time again, but he would always be reacting, never again leading a grand charge into the heart of the North. The psychology of the common soldier also shifted. For the Union troops, the victory at Gettysburg was a massive morale boost. They had finally and decisively beaten Lee's army in a major stand-up fight. The myth of Confederate invincibility was shattered forever. They now knew they could win. For the Confederates, while their fighting spirit remained incredibly resilient, the dream of a swift, decisive victory that would secure their independence had died on the slopes of Cemetery Ridge. The road ahead was now a grim, defensive struggle for survival. The battle had changed everything. It redefined the strategic possibilities for both sides and set the stage for the final, brutal phase of the conflict. The war would grind on, but after the summer of 1863, its ultimate conclusion was no longer in doubt. The Confederate retreat from Pennsylvania was the beginning of the end. Thank you for joining us for this chapter. The story of the war is far from finished, and we'll continue to explore the campaigns that followed in our next video. If you're finding this series valuable, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. We'll see you then. Welcome back to our series on the Civil War. Today, we're diving into Chapter 18, The Impact on the North. We've talked a lot about the battles, the strategies, and the immense suffering. But what was happening back home, north of the Mason-Dixon line? How did the tide of war, especially the major victories and the later stages, reshape the political and social landscape of the Union? This is a story of resilience, renewed purpose, and the consolidation of power that would ultimately seal the Confederacy's fate. Initially, the war was a tough sell for many in the North. The early years were marked by devastating losses and a seemingly endless stalemate. Think about the mood after battles like First Bull Run or Fredericksburg. Morale was at rock bottom. Newspapers were filled with casualty lists, and a sense of war weariness began to creep in. There was a significant portion of the population, often called the Copperheads, who actively opposed the war and called for a negotiated peace with the South. They saw Lincoln as a tyrant, trampling on civil liberties and needlessly sacrificing Northern lives. This anti-war sentiment was a powerful political force, and it posed a very real threat to Lincoln's presidency and the entire Union war effort. Lincoln was walking a political tightrope. He had to manage a coalition of Republicans, war Democrats who supported the military effort, and the ever-present opposition from the Peace Democrat. Every military defeat amplified the voices calling for an end to the conflict. It made recruitment harder. It made funding the war more difficult, and it weakened Lincoln's hand both at home and abroad. European powers like Britain and France were watching closely, and continued Union failures might have encouraged them to recognize the Confederacy, a move that could have been catastrophic for the North. The pressure on Lincoln was immense, not just to win the war, but to maintain the will to fight it. Then, things began to change. The Summer of 1863 was a pivotal turning point. In the East, the Union Army of the Potomac achieved a monumental victory at Gettysburg. This wasn't just another battle. It was a decisive repulse of Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North. The news sent waves of relief and jubilation across the Union. For the first time, Lee's army seemed beatable. The myth of his invincibility was shattered. Church bells rang, people celebrated in the streets, and a sense of optimism, long absent, began to return. Almost simultaneously, hundreds of miles to the west, another critical victory unfolded. General Ulysses S. Grant, after a long and difficult campaign, captured the fortress city of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. This was a strategic masterpiece. The fall of Vicksburg gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two. Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana were now cut off from the rest of the South, severing vital supply and communication lines. The strategic importance of this cannot be overstated. It was a body blow to the Confederacy's ability to sustain its war effort. The combined impact of Gettysburg and Vicksburg was like an electric shock to Northern morale. The string of demoralizing defeats was finally broken. These weren't minor skirmishes. They were massive, undeniable victories that demonstrated the growing strength and competence of the Union military. Suddenly, the possibility of total victory seemed not just a distant hope, but a tangible reality. The newspapers, which had once been filled with despair, now trumpeted these successes. The narrative began to shift from one of suffering and doubt to one of confidence and determination. This surge in public morale translated directly into political strength for Abraham Lincoln. The constant criticism from the Copperheads began to lose its sting. How could they argue for peace when the Union armies were finally winning? Lincoln's decisions, once questioned and attacked, now seemed vindicated. His support for generals like Grant, his Emancipation Proclamation, and his unwavering commitment to preserving the Union were all bolstered by these battlefield successes. This new political capital was crucial as the 1864 presidential election approached. For much of the war, Lincoln's re-election was far from certain. Many, even within his own party, doubted he could win. The Democratic platform in 1864 even called the war a failure and advocated for an immediate armistice. But the victories of 1863, followed by General Sherman's capture of Atlanta in September 1864, completely changed the political calculus. The capture of Atlanta, a major industrial and railroad hub for the Confederacy, was another huge morale boost. It was a clear sign that the Confederacy was crumbling from within. These military triumphs effectively silenced the anti-war movement. They gave Lincoln the mandate he needed to see the war through to its conclusion. His landslide victory in the 1864 election was a direct reflection of the public's renewed faith in his leadership in the war effort. The people of the Union had voted not for peace at any price, but for victory. This gave Lincoln the political freedom to pursue a strategy of total war, aimed at breaking not just the Confederate armies, but the South's will to fight. With his political position secure, Lincoln could fully empower his top generals, Grant and Sherman, to execute their final, decisive campaigns. He no longer had to worry as much about political blowback from heavy casualties or aggressive tactics. The Northern public, buoyed by the prospect of an imminent end to the war, was now more willing to accept the hard measures necessary to achieve it. This allowed for the implementation of strategies like Sherman's march to the sea and Grant's relentless overland campaign against Lee's army in Virginia. These final campaigns were brutal and destructive, but they were also incredibly effective. They were made possible because the victories at Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Atlanta had created a political environment in the North that would support them. The rising morale had given Lincoln the political shield he needed to let his generals do what had to be done. The soldiers on the front lines felt this shift as well. The knowledge that the home front was solidly behind them, that their sacrifices were leading to tangible progress, was a powerful motivator. They were no longer fighting a war that many back home questioned. They were now the agents of a nation united in its goal. In essence, the impact of these military victories on the North was a virtuous cycle. A victory on the battlefield boosted public morale. High morale translated into greater political support for Lincoln and his war policies. This strong political backing then enabled the Union leadership to approve and sustain the aggressive military strategies needed to achieve final victory. It shows just how interconnected the battlefield and the home front truly were. The war wasn't just won by soldiers and cannons. It was also won in the hearts and minds of the people in the cities and farms across the North whose renewed hope and determination gave their president the power to finish the fight. Thanks for watching. Join us next time as we explore the final days of the war and the beginning of the long road to Reconstruction. If you found this interesting, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. See you then. The cannons have fallen silent. The smoke has cleared from the fields of Gettysburg, but the story of this hallowed ground is far from over. In the quiet aftermath of the battle, as the nation grapples with its staggering losses, a new chapter is about to be written, not with swords and bayonets, but with words. Words that will echo through the ages. Words that will redefine the very soul of America. Just a few months after the fighting ceased, this landscape, scarred by conflict and consecrated by the blood of thousands, becomes the stage for one of the most powerful speeches ever delivered. President Abraham Lincoln is invited to the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery. He's not even the main speaker of the day. A famed orator is scheduled to speak for 2 hours. Lincoln is asked to provide just a few appropriate remarks. No one could have predicted what would happen next. No one could have known that in just over 2 minutes. With fewer than 275 words, Lincoln would capture the entire meaning of the war, the essence of the American experiment, and a vision for its future. He wasn't just there to dedicate a cemetery. He was there to rededicate the nation itself. Let's set the scene. Imagine the crisp November air, the solemn crowd gathered on that Pennsylvania field. The graves are still fresh. The grief is palpable. The nation is fractured, torn apart by a war that questions its very existence. The central question hanging in the air is, what was it all for? Why did so many have to die? Was the Union, this great experiment in democracy, a failure? It is into this atmosphere of doubt and sorrow that Lincoln steps forward. His speech doesn't dwell on military strategy or battlefield glory. It doesn't point fingers or celebrate victory in a triumphant way. Instead, he goes back to the beginning. He reminds everyone of the nation's birth, 87 years earlier, conceived in liberty and dedicated to a radical proposition that all men are created equal. This is the core of his message. He connects the sacrifice at Gettysburg directly to the founding principles of 1776. The soldiers who fought and died here, he argues, were not just fighting to preserve the Union as it was. They were fighting to give that Union a new birth of freedom. They were fighting to ensure that the promise of equality, laid out in the Declaration of Independence, would finally be realized for all. Think about how profound this was. In the middle of a brutal civil war, Lincoln is elevating the conflict. It's no longer just about preserving a political entity. It's about a moral and ideological struggle. It's about whether a nation founded on the principle of human liberty can actually survive. He calls the war a test, a great test, to see if that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. He masterfully shifts the focus from the past to the future. He says that the living cannot truly dedicate or consecrate the ground. The soldiers who died there have already done that far beyond anyone has power to add or detract. The real task, he insists, is for the living. It is for them, for us, to be dedicated to the unfinished work that the soldiers so nobly advanced. And what is that unfinished work? It is the great task remaining before them. It is the fight to ensure that the dead shall not have died in vain. It is the struggle to bring about that new birth of freedom. And ultimately, it is the mission to ensure that government of the people be the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. With these simple, powerful phrases, Lincoln gives meaning to the immense suffering. He transforms a military cemetery into a symbol of national purpose. The deaths at Gettysburg were not a tragic end. They were a sacrifice for a new beginning. He offers a vision of a unified nation, not just held together by force, but bound by a shared commitment to liberty and equality for everyone. The Gettysburg Address is a masterclass in communication. It is concise, poetic, and incredibly moving, but its true power lies in its enduring message. It's a message that challenged the America of 1863 to live up to its own ideals, and it continues to challenge us today. It reminds us that democracy is not a given. It is a promise that each generation must work to fulfill. It is a constant striving towards a more perfect union. As we continue to explore the Civil War, we will see how Lincoln S. Woods on that November day became a guiding star for the remainder of the conflict and for the difficult process of reconstruction that followed. They reframed the narrative of the war and gave the nation a moral compass to navigate the turbulent years ahead. The battle was over, but the fight for the soul of America, so eloquently defined by Lincoln at Gettysburg, had just entered a new, crucial phase. The seeds of a reborn republic were planted on that hallowed ground, waiting to grow. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this preview insightful, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next episode. See you then. Hello and welcome back to our journey through American history. Tonight, we arrive at a pivotal moment, a chapter that reshaped the destiny of a nation. Chapter 20. Why Gettysburg is remembered as the turning point. As the smoke cleared from the Pennsylvania fields in early July 1863, something profound had shifted, something more than just the outcome of a single battle. The 3 days of intense fighting at Gettysburg marked the high water mark of the Confederacy. General Robert E. Lee had brought his seemingly invincible Army of Northern Virginia onto Northern soil, carrying with him the hopes of a decisive victory that might force the Union to negotiate peace. He had gambled everything on this invasion, believing that a triumph in the North would shatter Union morale and earn the Confederacy foreign recognition. But that victory never came. The Confederate forces, after suffering devastating losses, were forced to retreat back to Virginia. This was more than just a tactical withdrawal. It was a retreat from the peak of their power. Never again would the Confederacy mount such a significant offensive into the North. The momentum they had built through a series of stunning victories had been irrevocably broken. The aura of invincibility surrounding Lee's army had been pierced, and the strategic initiative was about to shift permanently into the hands of the Union. For the Union, the victory at Gettysburg was a desperately needed breath of fresh air. Morale, both on the home front and in the army, had been dangerously low. The war was dragging on. The costs in blood and treasure were staggering, and a sense of war weariness was setting in. The news from Gettysburg, arriving just a day before the fall of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River, was like a jolt of electricity. Suddenly, there was proof that Lee could be beaten. There was tangible hope that the war could be won. This victory renewed the Northern public's confidence in their cause and their leadership. It strengthened President Lincoln's hand and quieted the voices calling for a negotiated peace. Soldiers in the Union Army, who had bravely stood their ground against fierce assaults, now carried a newfound belief in their ability to defeat their formidable opponents. The psychological boost was immeasurable. This leads us to the shift in public perception, both at home and abroad. Before Gettysburg, European powers like Great Britain and France were seriously considering recognizing the Confederacy. They were dependent on Southern cotton and were impressed by the South's military prowess. A decisive Confederate victory on Union soil might have been the final push they needed to intervene. But the defeat at Gettysburg, coupled with the Union's capture of Vicksburg, changed their calculus. The risk of backing a losing side became too great. The prospect of foreign intervention, which had been a constant hope for the South and a constant fear for the North, effectively vanished. The war would now be decided by Americans alone. Internally, the battle and its aftermath redefined what the war was about. A few months later, in November 1863, President Abraham Lincoln would stand on that same battlefield to deliver the Gettysburg Address. In just a few powerful words, he framed the conflict not just as a struggle to preserve the Union, but as a test of whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could endure. He gave the immense sacrifice a profound and lasting meaning, transforming the war into a fight for a new birth of freedom. This shifted public perception from a war of political reunification to a moral crusade, further galvanizing Northern support and setting a new, higher purpose for the struggle. So, when we look back, we see that Gettysburg was not the end of the war. 2 more years of brutal, bloody fighting lay ahead, but it was the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. It marked the point where the tide turned. From that moment forward, the path to a Union victory, while still incredibly difficult, became clear. The South was now fighting a defensive war, its resources dwindling, its manpower stretched to the breaking point. The North, with its industrial might and superior numbers, could now press its advantage relentlessly. The strategic initiative had been seized, and the Union would not let it go. Generals like Ulysses S. Grant would soon take command and implement a strategy of total war that would grind down the Confederacy's ability to resist. Gettysburg stands as a testament to the idea that history can turn on the events of just a few days. It was a crossroads where one path led to a fractured continent and the other, though paved with immense sacrifice, led toward a preserved and redefined United States. The courage of the soldiers on both sides was immense, their losses staggering, but the outcome set the nation on a new course. The momentum of the Confederacy was lost forever. Union confidence was reborn, and the world saw that the great American experiment, though tested by fire, would not perish. It was the decisive moment that ensured the war would end not with two separate nations, but with one, indivisible, and striving toward a new birth of freedom. And as we close this chapter, let the story of Gettysburg serve as a quiet reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the profound impact of a single turning point in the long, winding river of history. Thank you for listening. I hope you'll join us next time as we continue our journey. Follow our channel for more stories from the past. Sleep well. Lip well, por él.